What's up, guys? I'm so glad that you're sticking in there and you're coming back to learn this stuff about Matthew 24. And if this is the first video in this series that you're catching, let me just tell you that we're doing a study of Matthew chapter 24. And all we're trying to figure out is whether or not this chapter in your Bible is talking about the end of the world, or more specifically, is it talking about the second coming of Jesus, or the end of this material world that we live in? You know, is there going to be fire, falling stars, volcano eruptions, and stuff like that? Will there be a rapture and a big, great tribulation? We're trying to figure out if Matthew 24 is saying all of this. So why are we looking at Matthew 24, you ask? Well, because this is probably the most important chapter that many people look to when they're trying to find answers about the end of the world. Like, what's going to happen? What did Jesus say? Matthew 24 is like the go-to chapter for end time prophecy. And, you know, when people are looking for things to know about the end of the world or the Great Tribulation or the rapture or things like that. So it's important that we look at that chapter. So if you're just tuning in now, let me just do a quick recap on everything that we learned so far. In video 1, we learned about the 4 ways that people interpret end-time prophecy, which is just a big word for the study of what the heck's going to happen in the last days before the world ends. And we saw that Jesus was talking about all this judgment that was going to fall on Jerusalem and the Jewish people because of their disobedience to God and the murders of all the prophets they committed. And in part 2, we saw that Jesus told the disciples that their temple would also be destroyed. And they asked when this would happen and what would be the sign of his coming. And we learned that the Lord's coming doesn't mean his literal visit to planet Earth, as if Jesus was going to float down on a cloud to Earth or something like that. So they weren't asking him about that. But when they asked him about the sign of his coming, they were asking him when judgment was going to come to their people. There were many times, guys, in the Old Testament that God came, and all this phrase means is that he judged someone or a nation or a people. And usually it meant the destruction or the scattering of these people in this nation. And in the last episode, we learned that the disciples also asked him about the end of the age. And you know what? Let's just read those verses again real quick. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. Okay, so check out Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. It says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they asked him about the end of the age, not the end of the world. And we learned that the age there means the end of the age of law, the age that they were currently living under, where the Romans ruled over them and they had to obey the law of Moses. Now, times for the Jews were hard during this time under this age, because the Jewish people were ruled by another nation, the Romans. And it just wasn't like it used to be for them when they were ruled by a powerful king and they answered to no one but God. They had a lot of hardships during this time, the past few hundred years, because they became slaves. They were scattered by their nations. So they were looking for a new age, an age of peace and power restored back to them. And so now we're here, part 4. And I hope that you're learning something. Now, if I haven't asked you yet, let me ask you now. Do you think that this stuff is important? Let me tell you why I think it is. Because if Matthew 24 is talking about things that are going to happen in our future, and most people say they're very close to happening, then you as a Christian should want to know the crazy things that are fixing to happen. You'd want to be prepared, right? But for many people who believe these things, there's a certain level of fear and speculation that comes with it. Many people wonder if they're going to be found worthy to escape the destruction that's fixing to come to planet Earth in these last days. But if Matthew chapter 24 is not talking about things that are going to happen any day now, then we have nothing to fear. And instead, we can occupy until he comes and not be occupied with his coming. I like that saying. So now, back to the questions they asked Jesus. Here's what they all mean, just as like a recap to understand their questions. When will these things be? That means, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of your coming? That means, what will be the sign that you're about to bring judgment to our city and our people? What will be the sign of the end of the age? That question means, what will be the sign that this terrible age of bad breaks and law is about to end for us and the new glorious one comes? Now, the bigger question that we'll talk about in this video is whether or not all this has happened already. And if it did, when and how did it happen? Or are we still waiting on all this to happen in the future? Well, hold on. Everyone already agrees that the destruction of Jerusalem already happened in 70 AD. So that first question that they asked Jesus already happened. But what about the coming of the Lord and the end of the age? Well, you want to know what I believe? Now, I'm going to tell you why I believe it too, and we're going to expound on the rest of Matthew 24 and other scriptures to show you how I came to this conclusion. But let me just propose to you my thesis, if you will, first. I believe that the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Lord and the end of the age all happened at or around the same time. I believe that when the temple and the city were destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, it was the Lord's coming in judgment, just like Jesus said would happen in the previous chapters we read about. And when this happened, the former age that they were living in passed away. So the disciples asked him 3 questions, but they were questions about events that relate to each other, and they occurred at the same time to accomplish one main goal: to end the old age. But as you probably guessed it, not everyone holds that belief. How dare they not agree with me? I'm just kidding. But the disciples believed that all their questions would happen at or around the same time. But some people, they read these questions and they just totally pull them apart. They separate the destruction of Jerusalem and what they believe to be the coming of the Lord and the end of the age by thousands of years. They think that they were asking him about the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD, which they were, and then now they're asking him about the end of the world and the literal coming of Jesus in the future sometime. Very different events. But let me tell you why you should not look at it this way. In the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's something called parallels. And that's if you read these 4 books, you'll sometimes see them talking about the same things with maybe some minor differences and details. That's because each writer was recalling the event as they remembered it or how they saw it and perceived it. So for example, Matthew, Mark, and John, they all recall the story of Jesus when he was walking on the water. But only Matthew mentions Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water with him. So if you're reading something from one of these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, in order for you to get to better understand what you're reading, you should always also read the other versions of it as well in the other 3 books, if there are any. Now, sometimes you'll get more details or you'll get even more clarification about what it is that you're reading. So it's a good idea to do that. And guess what? There's also parallels to Matthew chapter 24 as well, and all this end of the age stuff as well. The parallels are in Luke chapter 21 and Mark chapter 13. So first, look at how they ask the questions in Luke 21, the parallel. The same thing happens. They're walking out and they point out to him the temple. Then he tells them that it's going to be destroyed. Then look at their question. It says, "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" So Luke says that they asked Jesus 2 questions. When will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign that it's about to be destroyed? Not what will be the sign of the coming of the Lord and the sign of the end of the age, but what will be the sign that the temple is fixing to be destroyed. Even in Mark chapter 13, verse 4. It says, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" What's the point? This is my point, guys. It's clear to see that Luke and Mark were asking about one event that's going to happen, when their temple and their city would be destroyed. So it's reasonable to think that whatever answers Jesus gives them to these questions, following their questions in Luke 21 and Mark 13, that they're all about the destruction of Jerusalem. All of his responses are about the destruction of Jerusalem. But in Matthew, they ask Jesus the same questions, but in a different way. They also ask about a coming and the end of the age. So does this mean that in Matthew, they were asking him like an additional 2 questions that they didn't ask him in Mark and Luke's account? Or is it possible that the coming of the Lord and the end of the age in Matthew 24 also revolves around the destruction of Jerusalem? I think so. And the questions that they ask him in Matthew, Mark, and Luke also all refer to the same thing. They're just written a little different in Matthew. So really, if you just read Matthew 24 and you never look at Mark and Luke, in order for you to avoid confusion on exactly what they were asking him, you'd have to know what the coming of the Lord and the end of the age mean. But lucky for you, you've been watching, so you do. You see, the disciples believed that all 3 things, the destruction of their city, the coming of the Lord, and the end of the age, they believed that all 3 would happen at the same time. But if the disciples thought that all these things would happen with the destruction of their city, why do some people today say that those last 2 questions that they asked about the coming of the Lord and the end of the age haven't happened yet? Well, honestly, some people just come right out and say it because the disciples were wrong. Some people say, yes, the disciples believed that the coming of the Lord and the end of the age would happen with the destruction of their city, but they were wrong. These 2 things won't happen, they say, until way later. Lots of things have to happen first until he comes back. But why believe that? I mean, I don't have a problem with saying that the disciples were sometimes wrong about things in their thinking and with their theology. Christ did have to correct them on several occasions throughout the New Testament about their theology and things that they said. But were they wrong about this? And if so, how and why were they wrong? Again, the million-dollar question is, did all these 3 things happen with the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, the first reason why some people say that the disciples were wrong and that the coming of the Lord and the end of the age won't happen until way later is because they simply just misinterpret what the coming of the Lord and the end of the age are. Now, I don't want to sound like a record playing over and over again, but the coming of the Lord in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3 is not referring to a literal physical coming of Christ to planet Earth to make war with Satan at the Battle of Armageddon in the future sometime. That's what most people call the second coming of Christ. And that's not what they asked Jesus about. So, pop quiz. What does the coming mean in this scripture? Some also don't interpret the end of the age the right way. It's not referring to the end of the world. So that's the first reason why some people still say that the coming of the Lord and the end of the age haven't happened yet, because of a misunderstanding of what they are. The second reason is because of a misunderstanding of everything else we're about to read in Matthew 24. So now that we know what the disciples were asking Jesus, we can move on. Remember, everything that he says is just an answer, just a response to their questions about the destruction of their city. Okay, let's go back to Matthew chapter 24 now. And after they asked him the 3 questions, this is how Jesus responds. Let's just read a little bit. It says, Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you." Actually, you know what? Let me back up and let's just read verse 3 again. Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Jesus tells them that some of the things that they're going to see around this time of his coming is that there's going to be false messiahs, and that they would hear of wars and rumors of wars. He says that you disciples will see these things. Now, let's just stop for a minute, because that word, the word you, that's one word that you're going to have to pay attention to as we keep reading this chapter. You. When somebody comes up to you and says, hey, you don't think they're talking to somebody, you don't think they're talking to somebody that's thousands of years in the future, right? They're talking to you. He says that you disciples will be around to see and hear these things, because they were going to happen during the times leading up to the destruction of 70 AD. Remember, that's the context of Matthew chapter 24 that we've gathered so far. Did they see an influx of false messiahs rising up, and did they hear about wars? Well, history says that they did. It was around the time when the Messiah was prophesied to come, according to Daniel. Everybody knew it was that time. So naturally, you probably have a lot of people stepping up, professing to be the Messiah. And wars? Well, the days leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem consisted of the Jewish and the Roman wars and many others. There's actually a very well-known ancient Jewish historian who goes by the name of Josephus. And a lot of what we know about the days of Jesus are actually thanks to his writings. A lot of his writings, they talk about all the wars that there were after Jesus' death. Even just 3 years after Jesus' death, a war broke out between King Herod and another king. Earthquakes and famines? You can even read about these in the book of Acts. There was an earthquake, of course, we all know, when Christ died and when Paul and Silas were in jail. But one Bible commentary actually says that perhaps no period in the world's history has ever been so marked by these convulsions as that which intervenes between the crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem. Other Bible scholars list the locations and years of all the horrible earthquakes that happened during this time. And of course, famines. These also happened before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and one is mentioned in Acts 11. And again, Josephus and other ancient historians, they write about these, saying that they were so bad that a day's worth of food cost 1 week's wage. So far, all these things were said to happen before the coming of the Lord in 70 AD, and they did. Okay. As sad as it is for me to say this, we got to stop here for time's sake. But before I go, let me ask you guys this. Isn't it cool how much clearer it makes things to simply get a biblical understanding of what the disciples were asking Jesus and not just assume what they were asking Jesus? When you interpret and you see things through the right lens, then you get the right interpretation. So now, the signs that we just read about, this little bit of signs, they make more sense. And it makes it easier to see that they happen in the days leading up to the destruction of their city, because that's what they were asking Jesus about, the destruction of their city. So next week, we're going to read about more things that Jesus said will happen in those days. And we're going to continue reading the rest of Matthew 24. And you're going to see how all these things that he talks about, they just fit into the context of their day. So you don't want to miss the next episode. If you finally want to know what Matthew 24 means and what all this end of the world stuff is floating around Christianity today, keep tuning in. I'll see you guys next week.